Book 6, Chapter 2 of The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 6, After Courses. Chapter 2, Thomasin Walks in a Green Place by the Roman Road. Clym saw little of Thomasin for several days after this, and when they met she was more silent than usual. At length he asked her what she was thinking of so intently.
"I am thoroughly perplexed,"
she said candidly.
"I cannot for my life think who it is that Diggory Venn is so much in love with. None of the girls at the Maypole were good enough for him, and yet she must have been there."
Clym tried to imagine Venn's choice for a moment, but ceasing to be interested in the question, he went on again with his gardening. No clearing up of the mystery was granted her for some time, but one afternoon Thomasin was upstairs getting ready for a walk, when she had occasion to come to the landing and call,
"Rachel!"
Rachel was a girl about 13 who carried the baby out for airings, and she came upstairs at the call.
"Have you seen one of my last new gloves about the house, Rachel?"
inquired Thomasin.
"It is the fellow to this one."
Rachel did not reply.
"Why don't you answer?"
said her mistress.
"I think it is lost, ma'am."
"Lost? Who lost it? I have never worn them but once."
Rachel appeared as one dreadfully troubled, and at last began to cry.
"Please, ma'am, on the day of the Maypole I had none to wear, and I seed yours on the table, and I thought I would borrow 'em. I did not mean to hurt him at all, but one of 'em got lost. Somebody gave me some money to buy another pair for you, but I have not been able to go anywhere to get 'em."
"Who's somebody?"
"Mr. Venn."
"Did he know it was my glove?"
"Yes, I told him."
Thomasin was so surprised by the explanation that she quite forgot to lecture the girl, who glided silently away. Thomasin did not move further than to turn her eyes upon the grass plot where the Maypole had stood. She remained thinking, then said to herself that she would not go out that afternoon, but would work hard at the baby's unfinished lovely plaid frock, cut on the cross in the newest fashion. How she managed to work hard, yet do no more than she had done at the end of 2 hours, would have been a mystery to anyone not aware that the recent incident was of a kind likely to divert her industry from a manual to a mental channel. Next day she went her ways as usual, and continued her custom of walking in the heath with no other companion than little Eustacia, now of the age when it is a matter of doubt with such characters whether they are intended to walk through the world on their hands or on their feet, so that they may get into painful complications by trying both. It was very pleasant to Thomasin, when she had carried the child to some lonely place, to give her a little private practice on the green turf and shepherd's thyme, which formed a soft mat to fall headlong upon them when equilibrium was lost. Once, when engaged in this system of training, and stooping to remove bits of stick, fern stalks, and other such fragments from the child's path, that the journey might not be brought to an untimely end by some insuperable barrier 1/4 of an inch high, she was alarmed by discovering that a man on horseback was almost close beside her, the soft natural carpet having muffled the horse's tread. The rider, who was Venn, waved his hat in the air and bowed gallantly.
"Diggory, give me my glove,"
said Thomasin, whose manner it was under any circumstances to plunge into the midst of a subject which engrossed her. Venn immediately dismounted, put his hand in his breast-pocket, and handed the glove.
"Thank you. It was very good of you to take care of it."
"It is very good for you to say so."
"Oh, no. I was quite glad to find you had it. Everyone gets so indifferent that I was surprised to know you thought of me."
"If you had remembered what I was once, you wouldn't have been surprised."
"Oh, no,"
she said quickly.
"but men of your character are mostly so independent."
"What is my character?"
he asked.
"I don't exactly know,"
said Thomasin simply.
"except it is to cover up your feelings under a practical manner, and only to show them when you are alone."
"Ah, how do you know that?"
said Venn strategically.
"Because,"
said she, stopping to put the little girl, who had managed to get herself upside down, right end up again.
Because I do.
You mustn't judge by folks in general,
said Venn.
Still, I don't know much what feelings are nowadays. I've got so mixed up with business of one sort and the other that my soft sentiments are gone off in vapor-like. Yes, I am given up body and soul to the making of money. Money is all my dream.
Oh, Diggory, how wicked!
said Thomasin reproachfully, and looking at him in exact balance between taking his words seriously and judging them as said to tease her.
Yes, 'tis rather a rum course,
said Venn, in the bland tone of one comfortably resigned to sins he could no longer overcome.
You, who used to be so nice.
Well, that's an argument I rather like, because what a man has once been, he may be again.
Thomasin blushed.
Except that it is rather harder now.
Venn continued.
Why?
she asked.
Because you be richer than you were at that time.
Oh, no, not much. I have made it nearly all over to the baby, as it was my duty to do, except just enough to live on.
I am rather glad of that,
said Venn softly, and regarding her from the corner of his eye,
for it makes it easier for us to be friendly.
Thomasin blushed again, and when a few more words had been said of a not unpleasing kind, Venn mounted his horse and rode on. This conversation had passed in a hollow of the heath near the old Roman road, a place much frequented by Thomasin, and it might have been observed that she did not in the future walk that way less often from having met Venn there now. Whether or not Venn abstained from riding thither because he had met Thomasin in the same place might easily have been guessed from her proceedings about 2 months later in the same year. End of Book 6, Chapter 2. Book 6, Chapter 3 of The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 6, After Courses. Chapter 3, The Serious Discourse of Clym with his Cousin. Throughout this period, Yeobright had more or less pondered on his duty to his cousin Thomasin. He could not help feeling that it would be a pitiful waste of sweet material if the tender-natured thing should be doomed from this early stage of her life onwards to dribble away her winsome qualities on lonely gorse and fern. But he felt this as an economist merely, and not as a lover. His passion for Eustacia had been a sort of conserve of his whole life, and he had nothing more of that supreme quality left to bestow. So far, the obvious thing was not to entertain any idea of marriage with Thomasin, even to oblige her. But this was not all. Years ago there had been in his mother's mind a great fancy about Thomasin and himself. It had not positively amounted to a desire, but it had always been a favourite dream. That they should be man and wife in good time, if the happiness of neither were endangered thereby, was the fancy in question. So that what course save one was there now left for any son who reverenced his mother's memory as Yeobright did? It is an unfortunate fact that any particular whim of parents, which might have been dispersed by half an hour's conversation during their lives, becomes sublimated by their deaths into a fiat the most absolute, with such results to conscientious children as those parents, had they lived, would have been the first to decry. Had only Yeobright's own future been involved, he would have proposed to Thomasin with a ready heart. He had nothing to lose by carrying out a dead mother's hope, but he dreaded to contemplate Thomasin wedded to the mere corpse of a lover that he now felt himself to be. He had but 3 activities alive in him. One was his almost daily walk to the little graveyard wherein his mother lay. Another, his just as frequent visits by night to the more distant enclosure which numbered his Eustacia among its dead. The third was self-preparation for a vocation which alone seemed likely to satisfy his cravings, that of an itinerant preacher of the 11th commandment. It was difficult to believe that Thomasin would be cheered by a husband with such tendencies as these. Yet he resolved to ask her, and let her decide for herself. It was even with a pleasant sense of doing his duty that he went downstairs to her one evening for this purpose, when the sun was printing on the valley the same long shadow of the housetop that he had seen lying there times out of number while his mother lived. Thomasin was not in her room, but he found her in the front garden.
"I have long been wanting, Thomasin,"
he began,
"to say something about a matter that concerns both our futures."
And you're going to say it now?
she remarked quickly, colouring as she met his gaze.
Do stop a minute, Clym, and let me speak first, for oddly enough I have been wanting to say something to you.
"By all means. Say on, Tamsy."
I suppose nobody can overhear us?
She went on, casting her eyes around and lowering her voice.
Well, first you will promise me this, that you won't be angry and call me anything harsh if you disagree with what I propose.
Yeobright promised, and she continued.
What I want is your advice, for you are my relation. I mean, a sort of guardian to me, aren't you, Clym?
"Well, yes, I suppose I am, a sort of guardian. In fact, I am, of course,"
he said, altogether perplexed as to her drift.
I am thinking of marrying.
She then observed blandly.
But I shall not marry unless you assure me that you approve of such a step. Why don't you speak?
"I was rather taken by surprise, but nevertheless I am very glad to hear such news. I shall approve, of course, dear Tamsy. Who can it be? I am quite at a loss to guess. No, I am not. 'Tis the old doctor. Not that I mean to call him old, for he's not very old after all. Ah, I noticed when he attended you last time."
No,
she said hastily.
'tis Mr. Venn.
Clym's face suddenly became grave.
There now, you don't like him, and I wish I hadn't mentioned him.
She exclaimed, almost petulantly.
And I shouldn't have done it either, only he keeps on bothering me so till I don't know what to do.
Clym looked at the heath.
"I like Venn well enough,"
he answered at last.
"He is a very honest and at the same time astute man. He is clever too, as is proved by his having got you to favour him. But really, Thomasin, he is not quite—"
Gentleman enough for me? That is just what I feel. I am sorry now that I asked you, and I won't think any more of him. At the same time, I must marry him if I marry anybody. That I will say.
"I don't see that,"
said Clym, carefully concealing every clue to his own interrupted intention, which she plainly had not guessed.
"You might marry a professional man, or somebody of that sort, by going into the town and forming acquaintances there."
I'm not fit for town life, so very rural and silly as I always have been. Do not you yourself notice my countrified ways?
"Well, when I came home from Paris I did, a little, but I don't now."
That's because you have got countrified too. Oh, I couldn't live in a street for the world. Egdon is a ridiculous old place, but I have got used to it, and I couldn't be happy anywhere else at all.
"Neither could I,"
said Clym.
Then how could you say that I should marry some town man? I am sure, say what you will, that I must marry Diggory, if I marry at all. He has been kinder to me than anybody else, and has helped me in many ways that I don't know of.
Thomasin almost pouted now.
"Yes, he has,"
said Clym in a neutral tone.
"Well, I wish with all my heart that I could say marry him. But I cannot forget what my mother thought on that matter, and it goes rather against me not to respect her opinion. There is too much reason why we should do the little we can to respect it now."
Very well, then.
Sighed Thomasin.
I will say no more.
"But you are not bound to obey my wishes. I merely say what I think."
Oh, no, I don't want to be rebellious in that way.
She said sadly.
I had no business to think of him. I ought to have thought of my family. What dreadfully bad impulses there are in me.
Her lips trembled, and she turned away to hide a tear. Clym, though vexed at what seemed her unaccountable taste, was in measure relieved to find that at any rate the marriage question in relation to himself was shelved. For several succeeding days he saw her at different times from the window of his room moping disconsolately about the garden. He was half angry with her for choosing Venn, then he was grieved at having put himself in the way of Venn's happiness, who was, after all, as honest and persevering a young fellow as any on Egdon, since he had turned over a new leaf. In short, Clym did not know what to do. When next they met, she said abruptly,
"He is much more respectable now than he was then."
Who? Oh, yes, Diggory Venn.
Aunt only objected because he was a reddleman.
Well, Thomasin, perhaps I don't know all the particulars of my mother's wish, so you had better use your own discretion.
You will always feel that I slighted your mother's memory.
No, I will not. I shall think you are convinced that, had she seen Diggory in his present position, she would have considered him a fitting husband for you. Now, that's my real feeling. Don't consult me any more, but do as you like, Thomasin. I shall be content.
It is to be supposed that Thomasin was convinced, for a few days after this, when Clym strayed into a part of the heath that he had not lately visited, Humphrey, who was at work there, said to him,
"I am glad to see that Mrs. Wildeve and Venn have made it up again, seemingly."
Have they?
said Clym abstractedly.
"Yes, and he do contrive to stumble upon her whenever she walks out on fine days with the child. But, Mr. Yeobright, I can't help feeling that your cousin ought to have married you. 'Tis a pity to make two chimney corners where there need be only one. You could get her away from him now, 'tis my belief, if you were only to set about it."
How can I have the conscience to marry after having driven two women to their deaths? Don't think such a thing, Humphrey. After my experience, I should consider it too much of a burlesque to go to church and take a wife. In the words of Job, I have made a covenant with mine eyes. When then should I think upon a maid?
"No, Mr. Clym, don't fancy that about driving two women to their deaths. You shouldn't say it."
Well, we'll leave that out.
said Yeobright.
But anyhow, God has set a mark upon me which wouldn't look well in a love-making scene. I have two ideas in my head, and no others. I am going to keep a night school, and I am going to turn preacher. What have you got to say to that, Humphrey?
"I'll come and hear 'ee, with all my heart."
Thanks. 'Tis all I wish.
As Clym descended into the valley, Thomasin came down by the other path and met him at the gate.
"What do you think I have to tell you, Clym?"
she said, looking archly over her shoulder at him.
I can guess.
He replied. She scrutinized his face.
"Yes, you guess right. It is going to be, after all. He thinks I may as well make up my mind, and I have got to think so too. It is to be on the 25th of next month, if you don't object."
Do what you think right, dear. I am only too glad that you see your way to clear happiness again. My sex owes you every amends for the treatment you received in days gone by.
Footnote. The writer may state here that the original conception of the story did not design a marriage between Thomasin and Venn. He was to have retained his isolated and weird character to the last, and to have disappeared mysteriously from the heath, nobody knowing whither, Thomasin remaining a widow. But certain circumstances of serial publication led to a change of intent. Readers can therefore choose between the endings, and those with an austere artistic code can assume the more consistent conclusion to be the true one. End of Book 6, Chapter 3. Book 6, Chapter 4 of The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 6, After Courses, Chapter 4. Cheerfulness again asserts itself at Bloom's End, and Clym finds his vocation. Anybody who had passed through Bloom's End about 11 o'clock on the morning fixed for the wedding would have found that, while Yeobright's house was comparatively quiet, sounds denoting great activity came from the dwelling of his nearest neighbour, Timothy Fairway. It was chiefly a noise of feet, briskly crunching hither and thither over the sanded floor within. One man only was visible outside, and he seemed to be later at an appointment than he intended to be, for he hastened up to the door, lifted the latch, and walked in without ceremony. The scene within was not quite the customary one. Standing about the room was a little knot of men who formed the chief part of the Egdon coterie, there being present Fairway himself, Grandfer Cantle, Humphrey, Christian, and one or two turf-cutters. It was a warm day, and the men were as a matter of course in their shirt-sleeves, except Christian, who had always a nervous fear of parting with a scrap of his clothing when in anybody's house but his own. Across the stout oak table in the middle of the room was thrown a mass of striped linen, which Grandfer Cantle held down on one side and Humphrey on the other, while Fairway rubbed its surface with a yellow lump, his face being damp and creased with the effort of the labour.
"Wax in the bed-tick, souls?" said
the newcomer.
"Yes, Sam,"
said Grandfer Cantle, as a man too busy to waste words.
"Shall I stretch this corner a shade tighter?"
Fairway replied, and the waxing went on with unabated vigour.
"'Tis going to be a good bed, by the look o't,"
continued Sam, after an interval of silence.
"Who may it be for?"
"'Tis a present for the new folks that's going to set up housekeeping,"
said Christian, who stood helpless and overcome by the majesty of the proceedings.
"Ah, to be sure, and a valuable one, I believe."
"Beds be dear to folks that don't keep geese, bain't they, Mr. Fairway?"
said Christian, as to an omniscient being.
"Yes,"
said the first dealer, standing up, giving his forehead a thorough mopping, and handing the beeswax to Humphrey, who succeeded at the rubbing forthwith.
"Not that this couple be in want of one, but 'twas well to show 'em a bit of friendliness at this great racket and vagary of their lives. I set up both my own daughters in one when they was married, and there have been feathers enough for another in the house the last 12 months. Now then, neighbours, I think we have laid on enough wax. Grandfer Cantle, you turn the tick the right way outwards, and then I'll begin to shake in the feathers."
When the bed was in proper trim, Fairway and Christian brought forward vast paper bags, stuffed to the full, but light as balloons, and began to turn the contents of each into the receptacle just prepared. As bag after bag was emptied, airy tufts of down and feathers floated about the room in increasing quantity, till, through a mishap of Christian's, who shook the contents of one bag outside the tick, the atmosphere of the room became dense with gigantic flakes, which descended upon the workers like a windless snowstorm.
"I never saw such a clumsy chap as you, Christian,"
said Grandfather Cantle severely.
"You might have been the son of a man that's never been outside Bloom's End in his life, for all the wit you have. Really, all the soldiering and smartness in the world in the father seems to count for nothing in forming the nature of the son. As far as that chief Christian is concerned, I might as well have stayed at home and seed nothing, like all the rest of you here. Though as far as myself is concerned, a dashing spirit has counted for summat, to be sure."
"Don't ye let me down so, father. I feel no bigger than a ninepin after it. I've made but a bruckle hit, I'm afeard."
"Come, never pitch yourself in such a low key as that, Christian. You should try more,"
said Fairway.
"Yes, and you should try more,"
echoed the Grandfer with insistence, as if he had been the first to make the suggestion.
"In common conscience every man ought either to marry or go for a soldier. 'Tis a scandal to the nation to do neither one nor t'other. I did both, thank God. Neither to raise men nor to lay 'em low. That shows a poor do-nothing spirit indeed."
"I never had the nerve to stand fire,"
faltered Christian.
"but as to marrying, I own I've asked here and there, without much fruit from it. Yes, there's some house or other that might have had a man for a master, such as he is, that's now ruled by a woman alone. Still, it might have been awkward if I had found her, for, d'ye see, neighbours, there'd have been nobody left at home to keep down father's spirits to the decent pitch that becomes a old man."
"And you've your work cut out to do that, my son,"
said Grandfer Cantle smartly.
"I wish that the dread of infirmities was not so strong in me. I'd start the very first thing tomorrow to see the world over again. But 71, though nothing at home, is a high figure for a rover. 71 last Candlemas Day. Gad, I'd sooner have it in guineas than in years."
And the old man sighed.
"Don't you be mournful, Grandfer,"
said Fairway.
"Empt some more feathers into the bed-tick and keep up your heart. Though rather lean in the stalks, you be a green-leaved old man still. There's time enough left to ye yet to fill whole chronicles."
Begad, I'll go to 'em, Timothy, to the married pair,
said Grandfer Cantle in an encouraged voice, and starting round briskly.
I'll go to 'em to-night and sing a wedding song, eh? 'Tis like me to do so, you know, and they'd see it as such. My Down in Cupid's garden was very well liked him for. Still, I've got others as good and even better. What do you say to my She called to her love from the lattice above, Oh, come in from the foggy, foggy dew. To please 'em well at such a time. Really, now I come to think of it, I haven't turned my tongue in my head to the shape of a really good song since old Midsummer Night, when we had the barley mow at the woman. And 'tis a pity to neglect your strong point where there's few that have the compass for such things.
So 'tis,
said Fairway.
Now, gie the bed a shake-down. We've put in 70 pounds of best feathers, and I think that's as many as the tick will fairly hold. A bit and a drap wouldn't be amiss now, I reckon. Christian, mull down the victuals from the corner cupboard of canst to each man, and I'll draw a drap or somewhat to wet it with.
They sat down to a lunch in the midst of their work, feathers around, above, and below them, the original owners of which occasionally came to the open door and cackled begrudgingly at sight of such a quantity of their old clothes.
Upon my soul, I shall be choked,
said Fairway, when, having extracted a feather from his mouth, for he found several others floating on the mug as it was handed round.
I swallowed several, and one had a tolerable quill,
said Sam placidly from the corner.
Hallo, what's that? Wheels, I hear coming.
Grandfer Cantle exclaimed, jumping up and hastening to the door.
Why, 'tis they back again. I didn't expect 'em yet this half-hour. To be sure, how quick marrying can be done when you've a mind for it.
Oh yes, it can soon be done,
said Fairway, as if something should be added to make the statement complete. He arose and followed the Grandfer, and the rest also went to the door. In a moment an open fly was driven past, in which sat Venn and Mrs. Venn, Yeobright, and a grand relative of Venn's who had come from Budmouth for the occasion. The fly had been hired at the nearest town, regardless of distance and cost, there being nothing on Egdon Heath, in Venn's opinion, dignified enough for such an event when such a woman as Thomasin was the bride, and the church was too remote for a walking bridal party. As the fly passed the group which had run out from the homestead, they shouted hurrah and waved their hands, feathers and down floating from their hair, their sleeves, and the folds of their garments at every motion, and Grandfer Cantle's seals dancing merrily in the sunlight as he twirled himself about. The driver of the fly turned a supercilious gaze upon them. He even treated the wedded pair themselves with something like condescension, for in what other state than heathen could people, rich or poor, exist who were doomed to abide in such a world's end as Egdon? Thomasin showed no such superiority to the group at the door, fluttering her hand as quickly as a bird's wing towards them, and asking Diggory, with tears in her eyes, if they ought not to alight and speak to these kind neighbours. Venn, however, suggested that as they were all coming to the house in the evening, this was hardly necessary. After this excitement, the saluting party returned to their occupation, and the stuffing and sewing were soon afterwards finished, when Fairway harnessed a horse, wrapped up the cumbrous present, and drove off with it in the cart to Venn's house at Stickleford. Yeobright, having filled the office at the wedding service which naturally fell to his hands, and afterwards returned to the house with the husband and wife, was indisposed to take part in the feasting and dancing that wound up the evening. Thomasin was disappointed.
I wish I could be there without dashing your spirits,
he said.
But I might be too much like the skull at the banquet.
No, no.
Well, dear, apart from that, if you would excuse me, I should be glad. I know it seems unkind, but, dear Thomasin, I fear I should not be happy in the company. There, that's the truth of it. I shall always be coming to see you at your new home, you know, so that my absence now would not matter.
Then I give in. Do whatever will be most comfortable to yourself.
Clym retired to his lodging at the housetop, much relieved, and occupied himself during the afternoon in noting down the heads of a sermon, with which he intended to initiate all that really seemed practicable of the scheme that had originally brought him hither, and that he had so long kept in view under various modifications and through evil and good report. He had tested and weighed his convictions again and again, and saw no reason to alter them, though he had considerably lessened his plan. His eyesight, by long humouring in his native air, had grown stronger, but not sufficiently strong to warrant his attempting his extensive educational project. Yet he did not repine. There was still more than enough of an unambitious sort to tax all his energies and occupy all his hours. Evening drew on, and sounds of life and movement in the lower part of the domicile became more pronounced. The gate and the palings clicked incessantly. The party was to be an early one, and all the guests were assembled long before it was dark. Yeobright went down the back staircase and into the heath by another path than that in front, intending to walk in the open air till the party was over, when he would return to wish Thomasin and her husband good-bye as they departed. His steps were insensibly bent towards Mistover by the path that he had followed on that terrible morning when he learnt the strange news from Susan's boy. He did not turn aside to the cottage, but pushed on to an eminence, whence he could see over the whole quarter that had once been Eustacia's home. While he stood observing the darkening scene, somebody came up. Clym, seeing him but dimly, would have let him pass silently, had not the pedestrian, who was Charlie, recognized the young man and spoken to him.
Charlie, I have not seen you for a length of time,
said Yeobright.
Do you often walk this way?
No,
the lad replied.
I don't often come outside the bank.
You are not of the Maypole?
No,
said Charlie, in the same listless tone.
I don't care for that sort of thing now.
You rather liked Miss Eustacia, didn't you?
Yeobright gently asked. Eustacia had frequently told him of Charlie's romantic attachment.
Yes, very much. I wish...
Yes?
I wish, Mr. Yeobright, you could give me something to keep that once belonged to her, if you don't mind.
I shall be very happy to. It will give me great pleasure, Charlie. Let me think what I have of hers that you would like. But come with me to the house and I'll see.
They walked towards Bloom's End together. When they reached the front it was dark, and the shutters were closed, so that nothing of the interior could be seen.
Come round this way,
said Clym.
My entrance is at the back for the present.
The two went round and ascended the crooked stair in darkness till Clym's sitting-room on the upper floor was reached, where he lit a candle, Charlie entering gently behind. Yeobright searched his desk, and taking out a sheet of tissue paper, unfolded from it 2 or 3 undulating locks of raven hair, which fell over the paper like black streams. From these he selected one, wrapped it up, and gave it to the lad, whose eyes had filled with tears. He kissed the packet, put it in his pocket, and said in a voice of emotion,
"Oh, Mr. Clym, how good you are to me."
I will go a little way with you,
said Clym, and amid the noise of merriment from below they descended. Their path to the front led them close to a little side window, whence the rays of candles streamed across the shrubs. The window, being screened from general observation by the bushes, had been left unblinded, so that a person in this private nook could see all that was going on within the room which contained the wedding guests, except in so far as vision was hindered by the green antiquity of the panes.
Charlie, what are they doing?
said Clym.
My sight is weaker again tonight, and the glass of this window is not good.
Charlie wiped his own eyes, which were rather blurred with moisture, and stepped closer to the casement.
Mr. Glenn is asking Kristingj Cantle to sing,
he replied.
And Christian is moving about in his chair as if he were frightened at the question, and his father has struck up a stave instead of him.
Yes, I can hear the old man's voice,
said Clym.
So there is to be no dancing, I suppose. And is Thomasin in the room? I see something moving in front of the candles that resembles her shape, I think.
Yes, she do seem happy. She is red in the face and laughing at something Fairway has said to her. Oh, my!
What noise was that?
said Clym.
Mr. Venn is so tall he knocked his head against the beam, hinkying a skip as he passed under Mrs. Venn, to return up quite frightened, and she's put her hand on his head to feel if there's a lump. And how they all be laughing again, as if nothing had happened.
Do any of them seem to care about my not being there?
Clym asked.
No, not in a bit. Now they're all holding up their glasses and drinking to somebody's health.
I wonder if it's mine.
No, 'tis Mr. and Mrs. Venn's, since he's making a hearty sort of speech. There. Now Mrs. Venn has got up and is going away to put on her things, I think.
Well, they haven't concerned themselves about me, and it's quite right they should not. It is all as it should be, and Thomasin at least is happy. We will not stay any longer now, as they will soon be coming out to go home.
He accompanied the lad into the heath on his way home, and returning alone to the house a quarter of an hour later, found Venn and Thomasin ready to start, all the guests having departed in his absence. The wedded pair took their seats in the four-wheeled dog-cart which Venn's head milker and handyman had driven from Stickleford to fetch them in. Little Eustacia and the nurse were packed securely upon the open flat behind, and the milker, on an ancient overstepping pony, whose shoes clashed like cymbals at every tread, rode in the rear, in the manner of a body-servant of the last century.
"Now we leave you in absolute possession of your own house again,"
said Thomasin, as she bent down to wish her cousin good night.
"It will be rather lonely for you, Clym, after the hubbub we have been making."
Oh, that's no inconvenience,
said Clym, smiling rather sadly. And then the party drove off and vanished in the nightshades, and Yeobright entered the house. The ticking of the clock was the only sound that greeted him, for not a soul remained. Christian, who acted as cook, valet, and gardener to Clym, sleeping at his father's house. Yeobright sat down in one of the vacant chairs and remained in thought a long time. His mother's old chair was opposite. It had been sat in that evening by those who had scarcely remembered that it ever was hers. But to Clym she was always a presence there, now as always. Whatever she was in other people's memories, in his she was the sublime saint whose radiance even his tenderness for Eustacia could not obscure. But his heart was heavy. That mother had not crowned him in the day of his espousals and in the day of the gladness of his heart, and events had borne out the accuracy of her judgment and proved the devotedness of her care. He should have heeded her for Eustacia's sake even more than for his own.
It was all my fault,
he whispered.
Oh, my mother, my mother. Would to God that I could live my life again, and endure for you what you endured for me.
On the Sunday after this wedding, an unusual sight was to be seen on Rainbarrow. From a distance there simply appeared to be a motionless figure standing on the top of the tumulus, just as Eustacia had stood on that lonely summit some 2 years and a half before. But now it was fine warm weather, with only a summer breeze blowing, and early afternoon instead of dull twilight. Those who ascended to the immediate neighbourhood of the barrow perceived that the erect form in the centre, piercing the sky, was not really alone. Round him, upon the slopes of the barrow, a number of heath men and women were reclining or sitting at their ease. They listened to the words of the man in their midst, who was preaching, while they abstractedly pulled heather, stripped ferns, or tossed pebbles down the slope. This was the first of a series of moral lectures or sermons on the mount, which were to be delivered from the same place every Sunday afternoon as long as the fine weather lasted. The commanding elevation of Rainbarrow had been chosen for 2 reasons. First, that it occupied a central position among the remote cottages around. Secondly, that the preacher thereon could be seen from all adjacent points as soon as he arrived at his post, the view of him being thus a convenient signal to those stragglers who wished to draw near. The speaker was bareheaded, and the breeze at each waft gently lifted and lowered his hair, somewhat too thin for a man of his years, these still numbering less than 33. He wore a shade over his eyes, and his face was pensive and lined. But though these bodily features were marked with decay, there was no defect in the tones of his voice, which was rich, musical, and stirring. He stated that his discourses to people were to be sometimes secular and sometimes religious, but never dogmatic, and that his texts would be taken from all kinds of books. This afternoon the words were as follows.
And the king rose up to meet her, and bowed himself unto her, and sat down on his throne, and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother, and she sat on his right hand. Then she said, I desire one small petition of thee. I pray thee say me not nay. And the king said unto her, Ask on, mother. for I will not say thee nay.
Yeobright had, in fact, found his vocation in the career of an itinerant open-air preacher and lecturer on morally unimpeachable subjects, and from this day he laboured incessantly in that office, speaking not only in simple language on Rainbarrow and in the hamlets round, but in a more cultivated strain elsewhere, from the steps and porticos of town halls, from market-crosses, from conduits, on esplanades and on wharves, from the parapets of bridges, in barns and outhouses, and all other such places in the neighbouring Wessex towns and villages. He left alone creeds and systems of philosophy, finding enough and more than enough to occupy his tongue in the opinions and actions common to all good men. Some believed him, and some believed not. Some said that his words were commonplace, others complained of his want of theological doctrine, while others again remarked that it was well enough for a man to take to preaching who could not see to do anything else. But everywhere he was kindly received, for the story of his life had become generally known. End of Book 6, Chapter 4. End of Book 6. End of The Return of the Native, by Thomas Hardy.